All right, well, we're going to pick up now on our third and final installment of Chapter 22 in the Raven text on the origin of species and talk about some fishes in Lake Victoria, Africa. So, Lake Victoria is a relatively young lake. Up until the past few decades, it's been home to around 300 or so species of cichlid fishes. So, for those of you who have experience with aquaria or have worked in pet stores or those kinds of things, you're familiar with cichlids. Very, very diverse group of fishes. They don't just occur in Lake Victoria; they're in other parts of the world as well. But Lake Victoria is particularly well known for the many, many species of cichlid fishes that it has. They've only been in Lake Victoria for about 200,000 years, which sounds like a long time. When you think about, how long is 100 years or 1,000 years? I mean, 200,000 years sounds like a huge amount of time, but geologically and evolutionarily speaking, it's a very, very short, almost blink of an eye time span. So to have that many species showing up in such a short period of time sort of makes you wonder how this could have occurred. And so what we sort of hypothesize is that as water levels fluctuate in Lake Victoria, as they still do today, sort of imagine a relatively shallow lake which has some deeper parts and some shallow parts, but overall it's not very deep. As water levels go down, what you're left with, rather than one big continuous body of water, you have what amounts to a bunch of puddles or ponds of water where species are permitted to live and diversify and eventually adapt to their conditions and potentially diverge from species in the next pond over, the next puddle over, where they've been doing the same thing, adapting to their environment. So when water levels come back up, all of a sudden you have again one big continuous body of water with a bunch of now different species of cichlids because they were sort of going for so long in these little subhabitats, they were able to diversify into separate species and they're now reproductively isolated. This has happened as recently as 14,000 years ago, and this is a relatively common occurrence. This is a dry part of the world. When a drought hits, water levels go down. The lake is no longer one big body of water, and you end up with several smaller lakes that are there as well. So, just to give you an idea of some of the diversity of these fishes, it has to do primarily with how they feed. Their diet is a direct predictor of what body size they're going to have, what type of jaws they're going to have. Cichlid fishes have essentially a second set of jaws back here in the back of the mouth, which is very adaptable and can be changed as new types of food are discovered and chewed over long periods of time. The jaws adapt as a result. So we see species which are called mud biters. One of my favorite things. If there's ever someone you don't like, just call them a mud biter. I mean, you got them right there, right? Species that chew or feed on algae off of rocks. Species that feed on leaves, dead leaves. They're called detritivores because of feeding on detritus or dead plant matter. Species which have crushing jaws to break up snail shells. Species that feed on zooplankton or little microscopic things swimming around in the water. Insectivorous insects, shrimp-eating insects, piscivorous fish, fish-eating fish, all as a result of this development of this second set of jaws. Now, I mentioned the extinctions which have occurred relatively recently. As recently as the 1960s and 70s, about 70% of the fish, cichlid species from Lake Victoria have gone away. And so in the 1950s, someone had the idea that they were going to introduce a different type of fish into Lake Victoria in the hopes of A, generating tourism dollars, generating a sport fishing industry in Lake Victoria for Nile perch, and secondly, providing more protein for the people living around Lake Victoria. Nile perch are a very, very large, very, very aggressive fish. These things can be up to 100 pounds, maybe 4 to 5 feet long. They are huge fish. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't mind going there to catch one just to see one of these things in person. But the drawback of this, of course, is that it takes a lot of smaller fish to build one very, very big fish. So those large piscivorous Nile perch pretty much wiped out a lot of these species of cichlids. Kind of a side note, the second thing that was done was someone introduced an aquatic plant into Lake Victoria, which is very, very aggressively growing, takes over large areas, eventually dies off, and as it dies off, creates anoxic conditions in the water. Oxygen levels go down, and whatever fishes are there tend to go belly up. So kind of a double hit to these little cichlids were the Nile perch as well as the aquatic plants that were introduced. Another type of example here is in New Zealand, and by the way, it is New Zealand, not this time, not New Guinea. This one actually is New Zealand. Are buttercups, very small flowering plants, similar to what we have in this part of the world in some cases. And so what we see in this case are 14 different species of buttercups that live in 5 very, very different habitats. And so again, at this point, I want to remind you that these examples are simply for illustration purposes only. I don't expect you to know a complete treatise on the life history of buttercups in New Zealand. That's not what this course is about. It's not botany. It's not the flora of New Zealand class. It's a class on general ecology, and right now we haven't been talking about evolution. So on these mountainous areas of New Zealand, we see 5 distinct kinds of habitats. We've got snowfields all the way at the top. Snowfields are places which essentially can't sustain tree life because it's too cold and too windy and too severe to have anything bigger than the smallest of plants. As we go down from there, we see what's called the snowline fringe, where trees start to pop up because conditions are just barely good enough to support trees. We move down from there, we've got more of a stony, kind of rocky soil where buttercups, again, can live, but as well, trees can live in this part of the mountain as well. Sheltered habitats below that, where we see trees. And then finally, we also have our boggy habitats. And you may be familiar with bogs in this part of the world. Very often have sphagnum moss growing there. They're saturated, very low pH, acidic type environments. Really, really cool place. If you ever get a chance to go to a bog, it sounds kind of corny, but type of ecosystem you'll never see anywhere else is in a bog. And you can almost actually walk out on these things. These sphagnum mats are so thick and so dense, you can actually walk across the water itself because the sphagnum moss will support you. These habitats are all, at times at least, somewhat isolated from each other. All right, so we have another case of what we call allopatric speciation. We have our 5 little species up here across the top, different flower shapes and colors and sizes and so forth. And so kind of imagine over here on the left, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 mountains, which are basically connected together. So a species of plant over here could sort of migrate over here or back here or even over here in the background without too much problem because the habitat is more or less contiguous. All 4 of these mountains are essentially connected to each other with habitat that is compatible with the other mountains. As the environment, as the climate warms up, the sort of grassy and tree, the more lush type of vegetation grows up the side of the mountain. And so species which normally like cooler temperatures migrate up to the top of the mountain. They're essentially on a little habitat island up here at the top of the mountain. They don't like this green, lush vegetation. They only like being up here. And when they're up here, they're very much isolated from the other 4 subpopulations. These are essentially habitat islands now. They're separated, just like being on an island out in the middle of the ocean. These mountaintops are separated from other mountaintops. And if this warm-up lasts for tens of thousands of years, they're going to stay isolated for tens of thousands of years. They're going to adapt to their own conditions. They're going to change. And so eventually when you bring them back together, these species of buttercups are no longer reproductively compatible. They have developed reproductive isolation, and so therefore they are separate species. One of the things that comes up and has been another source of great controversy in evolutionary biology is how the process of evolution actually happens on sort of a description of rate. Right? So for a long time, and this is kind of what Darwin was working under, his assumption was that evolution happened very gradually, continuously, but over very, very long periods of time. So on the left here, we have a gradualism model of what might produce 2 different species of birds in this case. So we've got the species down here, which is orange. One line of birds continues along this way and eventually ends up as being yellow. The other one eventually turns darker through time and ends up as being red. And so eventually these 2 species no longer are compatible, so they are in fact distinct species. A second model of this was sort of proposed back a few decades ago, that of punctuated equilibrium. So with punctuated equilibrium, the word kind of says it all. For a long period of time, you have stasis or you have equilibrium where nothing changes. It's essentially stagnation in the evolutionary process. So this bird goes along for a while, nothing changes, nothing changes, nothing changes, and all of a sudden, bang, you've got a change to a yellow phenotype. You don't have this sequence of orange to lighter orange yellow to eventually yellow. It goes from orange to yellow in one step. All right, so this y-axis here is time. And so whenever you have a lateral event, a horizontal event like this is essentially an instantaneous type speciation event. Now, it's not literally like it happens in a matter of seconds, but geologically speaking, or evolutionarily speaking, when it comes to the time scale involved, it might only be a few years or a few decades, which is really, really fast in the grand scheme of things. And so the orange line sticks around for a while. We've got the parallel line of yellow birds here. Orange stays around for a while and eventually goes, again, to another very rapid divergence. We go from orange to red in one step. And so the red continues along, the orange continues along, and eventually we have 1, 2, 3 separate species. All right, so we have both stabilizing selection and oscillating selection. Changes happen, changes don't happen. They kind of go back and forth and back and forth. And so we see long, long periods of no change followed by very short periods of extremely rapid change in the fossil record. In reality, as far as which one is the correct model, it's probably both and neither at the same time. It's probably somewhere in the middle for most speciation events. So it's more of a continuum rather than as a complete right or wrong answer at any point in time. Another question that kind of pops up, and you may have asked yourself, is we've talked about speciation. You know what extinction is. So if you kind of compare the two, which of these two do you think might be greater overall through time, the history of life on planet Earth? Do you think extinction rates have been higher overall, or do you think overall speciation rates have been higher? So take a second and think about that. Are speciation rates higher, or are extinction rates higher through time? And see if you can kind of convince yourself of what the right answer might be. Keeping in mind that maybe 3.5 billion years ago was the first time we saw species on planet Earth, there probably weren't that many. There may have even been a single individual or a single species which started off this whole process on Earth. Now, we've probably got 5 to 30 million species. So, okay, which is higher, speciation rate or extinction rate? Well, to go from 1 to 5 to 30 million, chances are probably speciation rate's a little bit higher, at least most of the time. Now, that is most of the time. There are or have been periods of time on planet Earth where extinction rate's been higher. One of these, called the Permian extinction, wiped out probably between 90 and 95%, at least of some taxa on planet Earth. The Cretaceous experience, the next to most recent extinction, we lost probably 75% of species on Earth. Most notably, the dinosaurs, or things we call dinosaurs, went extinct back at the end of the Cretaceous extinction. So, very, very dramatic, very, very short periods of time where we lose very, very high numbers of species. Historically, it's been natural causes, climate change, asteroids hitting the Earth, very large extraterrestrial bodies hitting the Earth, causing species to go extinct. And when that happens, very typically, we tend to lose a bunch of species. Not all species, but certain groups get hit really hard, and other groups tend to survive okay. They sort of hide out, they make it through the hard times, and eventually when the hard times are over, they diversify. Right? So the group that was dominant goes away. The one that was kind of hiding out, waiting in the background, becomes very popular and very abundant all of a sudden. So at the end of the Cretaceous, for example, we see dinosaurs going extinct, and the next group to take over was the mammals. Prior to the end of the Cretaceous period, mammals were around, but they were also very small, very secretive, kind of nocturnal sorts of things, which were probably insectivorous. They could make it during the nighttime when a lot of the bigger species of reptiles were probably at least a bit more sluggish. These mammals were safer at night because the reptiles probably would not have been as active at night as they would be during the day. So they're sort of kept in check by these large predators. After the dinosaurs go away, all of a sudden we see mammal diversity go through the roof because the mammals have been released from predation pressure. They no longer have any controls or checks on populations, and they diversify very, very quickly following that mass extinction. That is the case. It may take a while. It may take 10 million years to get back to the point where we have the same diversity as before the disturbance, but it will, or at least so far has happened, in every case that mass extinctions are followed by adaptive radiations. Now, we've gone through 5 mass extinctions so far, and they've been caused primarily by natural causes. The one that's going on right now is the 6th mass extinction, and so far it's not as severe as the other 5, but this one is unique in that it's being caused by humans. And so it's proposed that upwards of 25% of all species might be extinct by the time all is said and done. And this is all caused by humans, the effect that humans have on other species as well as the environment. The thing about this extinction is also the fact of what humans are doing to the environment itself. With past mass extinctions, we lose species, but the environment is still pretty much okay. With what humans are doing, some of the things that we're putting out into the air and water and soil, those things are going to be around for perhaps tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years. It's going to be a really, really long time for species to recover. 25% of all species, picture that, 5 to 30 million total species on Earth, we may lose a quarter of all of them. That's crazy. That's a huge number of species going extinct over a very short period of time as a result of human activity. So this picture here gives you a sense for what these extinctions look like, some of the past ones. Starting back a 500 million years or so ago, there were number of families. This represents a certain taxa of organisms. Number of families prior to that time was relatively low, almost zero. Over time, eventually these things increase. There are more and more families. All of a sudden we see a drop. And then overall the number of species goes up and goes up and goes up and goes up, and it drops again. There's our first big mass extinction, the Ordovician, which is the next to biggest extinction in the fossil record. And then things recover and they go up pretty quickly. And there's a couple of troughs and a couple of peaks and a trough and a peak, and all of a sudden we see another big mass extinction here in the Devonian. And then things go along for a while and all of a sudden we see this huge drop in the Permian. This is the big one. This is the one that wiped out almost all species on Earth as a result of, in this case, climate change. Also makes you a little bit wary about what we're doing to our environment there as well. If climate change can do this sort of a thing over millions of years, what can a climate change over the span of 300 years for humans do? And it's kind of scary when you think about it. We see a Triassic extinction up here, relatively small, and then that big Cretaceous extinction where we lose most of the dinosaurs is happening up there. There have been smaller mass extinctions. There are some up here as we get to present. For example, the Pleistocene extinction in North America, as humans came into North America through what is now Alaska, crossing the Bering Sea over a land bridge, which would have shown up as a result of low sea levels at that point in time. There was essentially a very large global cooling. A lot of water on Earth was tied up as ice, so ocean levels dropped, exposing a land bridge which connected Northeast Asia to Northwestern North America. Humans arrive, and almost simultaneously, all of a sudden, large mammals in North America go away. Prior to this time, there were North American lions, there were native North American horses, there were all kinds of North American fauna, which looks a lot like the stuff you see in the African savannas, isn't here anymore. Because those animals were pretty much wiped out, we think, by human hunting pressure during that period of time. We see similar things in Southeast Asia, Polynesia, all the islands across the Pacific Ocean. As humans arrive in time, we see die-offs of other species, especially big, huntable kinds of species like would have been there before humans showed up. All right, so what we're going to do now is take a look at what we call sexual selection, where mating essentially drives the evolutionary process. We're going to look primarily at intersexual selection, whereby female mate choice drives evolution in the phenotype of males. There is also intrasexual selection, where you have males typically fighting, often very vigorously to the death, for access to females. In that case, with intrasexual, with competition within the same sex, in other words, males competing with males, you tend to see presence of weapons in those males, so antlers and claws and fangs, and anything you can use to sort of beat up on the other guys, large body size, again, as in humans. Anytime you have sexually dimorphic species where males are a lot bigger than females, chances are males are somehow, duking it out for access to females. That's not what we're talking about here. For these few slides, we're going to talk about intersexual selection, where males are sort of trying to convince females to mate with them, trying to show them how good they are so that females will want to mate with them and choose their genes for their own offspring. All right, so this is another popular aquarium species. These are guppies, very common, very inexpensive species. And in these guppies, females tend to choose males which are more brightly colored. The gaudier, more fabulous males that have bright spots and stripes and blues and yellows and all kinds of iridescent colors on them tend to be picked more often by females. Now, is it just that the females have a sense for aesthetics? Do they just like bright, shiny things? Well, maybe, but that's probably not the most direct driver of mate choice in these species. As it turns out, these males are also more attractive to predators. So, okay, we've got a trade-off. If you happen to be a brightly colored male, you are A, more attractive to females, and B, also more attractive to predators. And there are, one of those is a good thing, one of those is not such a good thing. So why do females choose the males with the bright colors? Well, what this male is doing in this picture, this guy up here, this is a male up here on top, this is a female down here, and so males are advertising to females that they have good genes. And females are trying to choose the best genes for their own offspring so their own offspring are successful and continue to pass on their genes. So by mating with a male that's advertising his presence using these colors, this female is probably choosing the best possible genes for her offspring. In other words, if this guy is able to survive the handicap of being so obvious to predators, chances are if he survived this long, he must have some pretty good genes otherwise. Now, the female is not going through this conscious thought process trying to pick the male this way, but if you imagine there being a gene for mate choice behavior in females, the females that choose these males might be favored over females that choose more drably colored males. So trade-offs, right? They've also done manipulative experiments to test this, whereby this actually was in Trinidad in Central America. They took males from ponds where there were very dangerous predators, and males in those ponds tend to be very drab-colored so that they're able to hide out from predators and not get eaten. So maybe they're a little bit less attractive to females, but they also survive longer, so that's a plus. And they also chose males from ponds which didn't have any predators. And males in those ponds are extremely brightly colored because they're competing with all the other guys for access to females. And so, as you might expect, if you sort of sit back and maybe pause this for a second, when you take the drab colored males from the ponds with predators and move them to ponds where there are no predators, over time, over maybe 5 or 6 generations, the average, bright coloration-ness of males tends to increase. Males become more brightly colored when they're moved to ponds that have fewer predators. On the other hand, if you take the very brightly colored males from the ponds without predators, move them to the more dangerous ponds, over time there's going to be a duller coloration in those males because they're going to be picked out more frequently by those predators. Another example of mate choice here is in swordtail fish, yet a third example of an aquarium species of fish. Very common, very inexpensive. This is a male swordtail. So he has an extension of one of his fins back here, which produces something which has been called a sword for probably 100 years or more. And in this case, size matters. Females choose males that have longer swords. You can take whatever joke you want to insert there and go ahead and do that. The longer the sword, the better you are as a male. And so again, it's a handicap thing. If males can cope, if they can get by day to day having this very large protrusion from their body, chances are their genes are probably pretty good, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to mate with this guy because he's got some pretty good genes. They've done experiments here where they'll take a male which is pretty popular with the females. He's got a long sword. They will actually cut it off, remove it, and see what effect that has on his popularity with the ladies. And it turns out once that sword is gone, he might as well be invisible to the female fish. They're not going to choose him anymore once that tail is gone. He doesn't have a good personality. It doesn't matter. It's the tail that actually draws in the females in this case. This one actually is not an example of sexual selection. It's another example of natural selection in effect here. This is a very widespread one, a very problematic one, in fact, because it deals with pesticide resistance in insects. It also works with herbicide resistance in weeds, kind of the same idea. So if you were to go back even 10 or 15 years, Combat was a very, very common pesticide. You could buy it in grocery stores, you could buy it in Walmart, and it was designed to take out roaches, right? Good old cockroaches that maybe live in your house. This stuff has a very sweet taste to it, and when roaches come along and consume this stuff, because presumably it's good tasting, they're going to carry it back to the nest, they're going to spread it, and they're going to wipe out that colony, right? So it's an extremely strong selective pressure. There is no stronger selective pressure than death. So whenever you have a very strong selective pressure, unless you wipe out the entire species, the stronger the selective pressure, the faster the evolution is going to happen. And we've seen this time after time after time. Whenever we come up with pesticides, whenever we think we have a way of controlling something, whatever that something is, tends to be smarter than us, tends to outwit us, and tends to win. So in this case, there actually was a subpopulation of roaches that apparently had a mutation which caused them to avoid glucose. They didn't like the way glucose tastes. So, Combat has a sweet taste to it. These roaches, for some reason, don't like sweet-tasting things. They avoid the poison. They are selected for because all the other roaches that are flocking to that very sweet-tasting poison are going to die. The ones that don't like the glucose survive. They're going to continue to pass on that mutation, and through time, the pesticide becomes less available. The roaches won't touch it anymore because they all have the avoid glucose type mutation. DDT, another example. Back during World War II, kind of the first time the chemical industry came in a big way for getting rid of insects was during World War II, trying to control mosquitoes that could potentially spread malaria to our GIs. Malaria is extremely cheap. For a long time, it was extremely effective, and so DDT was used widespread throughout a lot of the world, and still is in some cases because it's so inexpensive. But what happens through time is those mosquitoes and whatever else start to become resistant to the DDT. The more you use it, the faster they become resistant. Unless you wipe out every single one, you're going to be selecting for a few resistant types. Right? So now, in parts of the world, if you spray DDT from an airplane, the mosquitoes won't even blink. They don't even care because they're not susceptible to it anymore. Mutations show up for resistance. If you apply the selective pressure, if you get rid of all the susceptible ones, only the resistant ones are left. The next time you apply the pesticide, all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. DDT's got kind of a long backstory to it too. It's one that's no longer used in this country. It's illegal to use it, buy it, or sell it in this country because it is so harmful to not only big predatory species, but also humans. It's also very persistent in the environment. It doesn't break down very quickly, if at all. So it's impossible to actually get rid of it once it's in the environment. You actually can't buy it or sell it anymore in the United States. On the other hand, in other parts of the world, malaria is more of a problem, and in places that also don't have a lot of money, DDT is kind of the pesticide of choice. And as it turns out, because there's a market, the United States actually is the biggest maker and exporter of DDT in the world. So you can make it here, you can sell it to other people, you just can't use it because it's such a nasty compound. It essentially is a hormone mimic, and when people get it into their bodies, it starts to have effects on sexual development in humans, as well as all the other nasty side effects it has in other animals. Same thing with pathogen resistance. So bacteria, so-called superbugs, things like MRSA, multiple resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or there's another name for it as well, but it's kind of the same idea. This Staphylococcus aureus is no longer susceptible to the antibiotics, to the medicines. And so if they're no longer resistant, we can't control them. We can't treat infections if we don't have the antibiotic that's workable anymore. So the stronger the selective pressure, the more antibiotics you use as a population, as a society, the more quickly these things are going to tend to happen. This example is a little bit less doom and gloom. These are called bowerbirds, and so they live again in the realm of Australia, New Zealand, and those kinds of places. And what they do, the males of this species build nests to try to attract the females. And they not only build the nest, they also furnish the nests. So they go out and they collect different things. And each species of bird builds a different shaped nest and goes out and collect different types of things. This one up here likes to collect round white or gray colored things like shells. You can see a snail shell here and here, or old eggs that have been broken. And it sort of litters those around the nest that it builds like this. This one down here is a little bit less elaborate, so it's basically a little depression in the grass here. The other grass has been knocked down. This is the nest, and this species likes blue things to decorate its nest. They'll go out and find whatever blue things they can find, whether they're feathers or flower petals or bits of plastic, Coke bottle tops, whatever the case, they're going to spread those around the nest. This one over here is the most elaborate. Right, so this looks like it was built by a person. It's like a little, almost like a lean-to or a teepee or a hut that you might find somewhere. And these little piles are also, this looks like a campsite. It looks like a person made this thing. They went out and collected a bunch of berries. They collected these things and collected those and these orange things over here. And it's a very well-kept nest. This is saying, all right, ladies, this is my house. Check out my plasma screen TV. Check out all the cool stuff I have. And by the way, when you're here, will you please also mate with me? It's not quite that far, but that's pretty much what it is here for these birds. Females go along nest to nest. They're called in by the males. They check out the nest. They choose the male who has what they think is the best quality nest. By doing so, they're getting a couple things. They're getting a really good look at the quality of that male's genes. If he can afford to build something this elaborate, if he can spend this much time and energy building something, chances are his genes are pretty good. He's able to forage. He's able to gather stuff. He's able to avoid predators when he's out moving around. This is the guy that's going to have the best genes to pass on to your offspring. And again, just keep in mind, this is not such a conscious process in the birds. We attribute these characteristics to birds and other animals. We anthropomorphize things, but that's kind of the crux of this. The genetic behaviors that are selected for are either to A, go out and collect things if you're a male, build nests, or B, choose the males that have those things if you're a female. They are genetically controlled activities. It's actually interesting. These males in these species will actually go out and try to rob other males. So when they're gone, going out to find more shells or more berries or whatever it is, Snickers wrappers, whatever it happens to be, other males might come in and choose to steal things from their nest and take those back to their own home and decorate them accordingly. So there's kind of a warfare that goes on between males in these species. Another example of natural selection, this is actually in Latin America, Central America. I think it was in Trinidad. Kind of like with those guppies. These are species of animals, so again, small lizards, which live on different types of islands with different types of vegetation. The first type of island has vegetation which has short, thick branches. The second island has vegetation with very long and very thin branches. And the lizards that live on both islands are sort of shaped accordingly. The islands that have the branches with the short, thick traits tend to have lizards with short, thick limbs. Islands that have long, thin branches tend to have lizards with long, thin legs because it makes them more agile and quicker, and they can move around more easily and more efficiently and more safely on those islands, on those thin branches. If you transport or transplant either phenotype to the different islands, thick legs to thin branches or thin legs to thick branches, after a span of a couple of years, all of a sudden the leg thickness average changes within the population. So by changing the phenotype on the islands, selection kicks in and we start seeing a movement toward a more effective leg size in these species. Widow birds, because it's kind of your avian or your bird version of what we saw with the swordtails. This is a widow bird. It looks a lot like, at least from from the legs up, like a red-winged blackbird like we have in this part of the world. But then you look back here and you see this huge, ridiculously elaborate series of tail feathers, which is the long tail of their name. So again, if you're a female, size matters. This guy right here is going to be pretty attractive because if he has the energy to grow that, if he has the ability to find enough food to be able to make such a ridiculously long tail, chances are his genes are pretty good. He's also able to avoid predators. This thing is like an anchor slowing him down. So this guy is able to get out there and survive despite the handicap of that long tail. He's probably got some pretty good genes. Females, as you get a sense for in this picture up here, are very small, very drab, definitely do not have a long tail like the male does. More of a generic kind of looking bird. So this again is a manipulative type experiment where, okay, we've got 4 different males that all have roughly the same tail length. And they all have roughly the same mating success. This one's making, maybe 1.3 nests on average. This one makes about 1.5 nests per average. This one makes about the same. This one makes about, this is the Brad Pitt of widow birds up here. He's making maybe 1.7 nests on average per year. And then we're going to start messing with these birds. So we're going to take this guy over here. This guy with the short end of the stick. He's going to have his tail cut off. So they're going to catch him. They're going to cut off his tail. And look what happens to his mating success. It goes from 1.7 to 1.8 to maybe down to less than half of a nest per year. So 1 nest every 2 years kind of a thing. Not a very good ratio, especially considering what he had before. This guy over here is sort of a control in that we're going to take his tail, cut it off, glue it back on, and what we see is his mating success doesn't really change very much. This one is a control again. This one inexplicably actually, they leave him alone. So before the manipulation, he's got 1.5 nests. After, he's got 0.5 nest. So it went down despite the fact they didn't do anything to him. And that's kind of hard to explain that one. This is the reason why you typically want to do more than 1 bird of each type to rule out any kind of these unknown variables which might play a role here. This one over here was the lucky bird. He had his tail I guess augmented might be the word for it. So we're going to take the tail from this guy over here and glue it on to this guy's tail. So his tail's twice as long. Look what happens to his mating success. It's all the way up around maybe 1.8 nests per male. The other thing which kind of may play a role in female choice is males that have these very nice, long, elaborate tail feathers probably don't have a real high parasite load because parasites in birds tend to chew up feathers and make them look kind of ratty and mangy. This guy definitely doesn't have that, so if a female mates with him, she can be reasonably sure that he's not going to give her parasites. And again, this is one of those life lessons for you. When you're choosing a mate, guys, try to find a mate that doesn't have a lot of parasites. Right? That's just words to live by. Look for a mate that doesn't have parasites, and you can't go wrong in that case. So just kind of take that for what it's worth. All right, so as we've seen before, there are trade-offs in natural selection. There are cases where, like in these toads, males that elicit very strong responses in females are the males which tend to call the loudest and call the most frequently. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. The noisy male gets the females. He's able to grab a female, go into amplexus. When she releases her eggs, he can then release his sperm outside of the body and fertilize the eggs outside of the body. So males that are louder and more obnoxious and call more frequently are the ones that get the most females. But being loud and being obnoxious and calling frequently isn't always a good thing because there may be other things out there which could hear that, right? So whereas female mate choice tends to select for really, really loud, really, really noisy males, predation by bats tends to select for quieter males. It's a balancing act between what's just long enough to get a female and what's too long and might land you in the jaws of a bat, right? And so wherever natural selection and sexual selection balance out, that's where you're going to find the most common phenotype. We even see adaptation in plants. Of course, so far we've talked primarily about animals, but of course plants can adapt just as well. This is a kind of a cool case. We've got a plant which is actually parasitizing an animal. Think about how often we see that. Usually it's the other way around. Plants are parasitizing animals. This plant right here produces a very, very elaborate flower which has this funny looking little structure here. And this funny structure right here is actually a mimic of a female wasp. Not only does it look vaguely, if you sort of squint your eyes and tilt your head, it looks kind of like a female wasp. This is a male wasp over here just for comparison. Right? So you can kind of imagine mouth parts and antenna. This is the head here in the front end. thorax, abdomen back here, right? So it kind of looks like a wasp, and more importantly, it also smells like a female wasp. It's going to attract males in. They're going to try very, very vigorously to no avail to try to mate with this flower because, again, they think it's a female. They're going to have this whole flower a rockin', as the expression goes, and they're essentially going to bring their back into contact with this part of the flower up here, which happens to be the anthers, the male pollen-producing part of the flower. They're going to get pollen all over their back. Eventually, they're going to give up. They're going to get very frustrated. They're going to move on to the next flower. They've got a short memory. They're not terribly bright. They're going to try to mate with the next flower, and in the process, they're going to move the pollen from this one onto the next flower, thereby completing cross-pollination. In this case, we have the males getting nothing. They're wasting energy. They're wasting a bunch of patience and becoming very frustrated. If they had blood pressure, it would probably be up at this point. And we have plants that are going to benefit in this case by having males pollinate the flowers for them. So that's actually the end of this lecture. I hope you guys have found the online version to be, if not enjoyable, at least not too painful. It's been kind of a learning experience for me, both on how to speak during these things as well as how to run the technology. So hopefully I'll continue to get better and use these more and more in the future if they seem like they're going to be a good way to go. So I'm going to be kind of counting on you guys to give me some feedback as to whether you like this or didn't like it. I certainly wouldn't hold it against you, but just let me know, what did you like, what didn't you like? Did you like being able to pause it and go back? Maybe it put you to sleep completely, I don't know. But just take it and see what you think, and I'd appreciate it. All right, so until next time, I guess I'll sign off of here, shut everything down, and we will see you in class next time.